Charles Petrie. Charles, welcome to the Irrawaddy. So I just want to start to shoot a question that I just learned that you recently made a trip to the border areas, looking over Karenni state and the Karen state. So just can you please share your thought, what you have witnessed over there, what you saw, and your experiences, and your maybe changing thoughts over the situation in our country where the civil war is raging.
Thank you for having me and for giving me an opportunity to share with you what I was able to pick up. I guess the first thing that really struck me is how devastating the situation is for the population in Karenni state. How the SACs, airstrikes, mortars, the drones, those attacks, the attacks of hospitals, the targeting of hospitals, targeting of schools, targeting of churches, targeting of IDPs, how much that has traumatized and has really, how much suffering it's brought to the people of Karenni state. What has also struck me is how this suffering, trauma is translated not into submissiveness, but into absolute hate for the SAC. So that is something that struck me, is the suffering that the people are being subjected to. The other, and it comes back, your question comes back to your question, how have things changed, compared to the past? I think in three ways, I guess my understanding. The first, which is an extension of the observation on the suffering of the people, is a sense that the SAC has actually lost control of the country and the people. Lost control of the country because of course they control pockets, but in terms of land movement, they're forced to mobilize significant resources to go from point A to point B. They're very dependent for their operations on air, but more importantly, lost control of the people. Again, these populations that are being subjected to mortaring and airstrikes are not scared of the SAC, they hate them. But also I think what's been interesting, and that's sort of the second observation, is there are a new generation of Myanmar nationals, a young generation, a generation of Myanmar nationals who grew up, whose formative years were during that period of relative openness that came after 2011, 2012. So it's a generation that no longer had to buy a SIM card at $2,000 per card, but were able to buy very cheap SIM cards. So it's a generation that's very interconnected, connected with the outside world, very invested in social media. They have their own language, they have their own way of looking at life, much, much more open. And above all, they don't have the same fear of the military that their parents had. When I was in Myanmar 2003 to 2007, what struck me was how the way the SPDC controlled the people is by getting the people to self-censor their actions. So periodically they would bring somebody to trial for having somehow infringed on a law, but ultimately it's the people themselves who censored their actions. So that doesn't exist anymore. Are you saying
it's self-inflicted?
It was self-imposed.
Self-imposed.
Yeah, not imposed because the costs were so enormous, but that they don't have. And then also I think we have a new generation of young Myanmar who don't also have the same. They're not beholden to the same Myanmar traditions. Their music is different. And that I think is a fundamental change fundamental change in the socio-political landscape, and it's a youth movement that believes it's at the forefront of a revolution. rather than, this is more than civil war. I met somebody who told me, this is not just civil war, this is a revolution. And you feel it when you see the young. And then the third observation, and this really comes from Karenni State, is this emergence of the local governance. I think what we're seeing in Karenni is the establishment of the structures and systems of governance, but as it's being established, the people have an opportunity to input into its establishment through a whole series of consultations at the village track, and other levels. So that, I think, is quite extraordinary.
Thank you, Charles. You used to be head of the UN agencies in Myanmar or in Burma from 2003 to 2007. Today, the international opinion or governments around the region were talking about humanitarian corridor or humanitarian assistance to be delivered to the people in need. And those areas in Karen states or Karenni states or Shan states or Chin. So Myanmar today is very fragmented, and there are millions of people, if I'm not wrong, are in need of humanitarian assistance. But now, as you said, there's an ongoing revolution in Burma or in Myanmar. So how do you see that, at first, how do you see that the humanitarian situation in the country, how can the external actor can help to relieve or alleviate the situation on the ground?
I mean, that's a very good question, and I don't think the answer is easy. I think the discussions that are starting around this humanitarian corridor that the Thai government has launched, I think is very positive. I mean, the notion of a humanitarian corridor is somewhat difficult to really understand, but the fact that Thailand is starting to engage in such a reflection, I think, is an opportunity, and it's an opportunity that needs to be seized. In terms of assistance, my sense is that classic humanitarian aid, that in a context like Myanmar, we are seeing the limits of classic humanitarian aid, because the essence of humanitarian aid is the ability to negotiate access. But when the regime in question is considered illegitimate or pariah by the West, you can't negotiate, because again, the essence of negotiation is you give a little to get a lot back, but you can't give anything, because the groups outside will not allow you to. So in that sense, your ability to negotiate that access is extremely limited. I think, I mean, for me, so that's one side. I think on the other side, in terms of the answer to the question, you know, as you were saying, Myanmar has fragmented, but it's fragmented into increasingly autonomous areas. So of course, the ethnic armed groups, they had already well established. But for example, in Karenni, you see the emergence of a new form of governance structure. And that, I think, offers an opportunity to provide support, that you can, I mean, so I think it's an opportunity to provide support in a way that helps build the local governance capacities of these areas. Of course, what donors will say is, you know, I've heard one say, you know, in 10 years' time, we don't want to be accused of having been responsible for the breakup of Myanmar. And I'm arguing that's, yeah, you're not going to be responsible for that. I mean, you know, you need to look at the situation as it is, you know, and the situation as it is an emergence of greater autonomous areas. None of these areas, except for, you know, I mean, even the one, none of these areas are pushing for independence. They want a level of autonomy. So if you're willing to acknowledge that, then you have the basis for a bottom-up form of federalism. You know, and that's, so in answer to your question, I think there is an opportunity with Thailand's developing this idea of humanitarian corridor, even if that may not be the result, but I think there's an opportunity to follow there. I think one needs to accept that humanitarian aid has its limits because of the way it operates. And I think there's also an opportunity to work with local governance structures.
So explain us about local governance and in this time of revolution, in this time of the debate about how to deliver the humanitarian assistance to the people on the ground. So how can international organizations or NGOs or even UN agencies can work with the local governance without going through the SAC? Without going through the SAC, how can they have access to those regions? And how to empower the local? Because of, I think, this old thinking and old structure stay in place in the international organization, including the UN. You know better than me. How can people work with the local governance, newly emerging actors?
I think your well, it's a good question. Your last point is very strong. It's the fact that they're constrained in old way of thinking. I think the first thing is to acknowledge that these local governance structures exist and to try and understand them. I think what's emerging in Karenni is fascinating in terms of the participatory approach that the local authorities are taking in establishing an administration. And they're doing it because for a large part, many of them come from civil society. They're former civil society leaders. So that's fascinating. I think what's also interesting about the Karenni experience is how it's also influencing other areas, the KNU and other groups where they're also trying to set up these interim executive structures. In terms of the UN and others, everybody accuses the UN of being in bed with the regime, and each time they sign something, it's seen as further complicity. For me, that's not the problem. The problem isn't the fact that the UN is engaging with the regime. The problem is they're not doing anything else. In a way, if you engage with the regime, it should give you the confidence to engage with groups outside. When I was the UN rep in Myanmar, the regime was extremely uncomfortable with me seeing the ethnic armed groups in Chiang Mai and Bangkok and Mae Sot. But I would do it. And then what I would do is I would go when I'd come back, I would go see a senior official from the regime, and I would talk about this and that, and then I would just let slip, so they would say something, and I'd say, that's really interesting. When I met David Tor last week in Chiang Mai, he said exactly the same thing. So I was finding indirect ways of letting them know that I was seeing the groups on the other side. So I think there's no reason why the UN shouldn't engage with groups outside. There's no reason why they shouldn't engage in provide assistance in areas not under control of the SAC. It's just they're not doing it, and they're not smart enough to find ways of doing it, because their mandate is to do it, and you can do it. So I think we're stuck with a UN system that lacks imagination and that lacks courage. But there's absolutely no justification for not engaging with the groups operating outside.
So Charles, are you saying that UN has a mandate to engage with all actors?
The humanitarian mandate gives them the obligation to engage with all actors to try and to get assistance to reach the people in need.
But they are not doing it.
No, they're not.
So UN is rather like a distraction, that UN is not doing anything?
No, I think the UN is basically irrelevant.
Irrelevant.
I mean, that's the problem, is that they, in a situation of such horrific tragedy, the UN has not been able to position itself.
As a former head of the UN agencies in Myanmar, Charles, you just said that UN is no longer relevant in Myanmar.
Yeah, exactly. That given the context, given, as I said, the horrendous suffering, I mean, it's difficult to imagine the extent to which the population is traumatized and suffering, you know, given what the UN was created for, you know, given you know, the UN comes out of 2 world wars, a commitment, you know, to help create a better world. Mm-hmm. Given the opportunities to do it, yes, I think the UN has failed the people of Myanmar.
But at the same time, we've seen reports that the UN appeal for more international assistance and aid for Myanmar people. How do you see that?
Well, the appeals aren't necessarily well met, which I think is a reflection of the lack of confidence in the UN that the international community has. And I would, you know, I mean, again, you know, from engaging with communities in Karenni, I don't really see, in terms of the most vulnerable populations, I don't really see the same level of support reaching the people than has been requested from donors. There's a little bit of a disproportionate element between the level of the appeals and the actual assistance going to the people.
Have you given up on the UN?
The answer is absolutely not. As you know, I served more than 20 years with the UN. I was in Rwanda during the genocide. I was the Deputy Humanitarian Coordinator. Before that, I was in Somalia during Black Hawk Down. So I was chairman of Admiral Howe's Crisis Action Group. You know, I spent 3 years with the Congolese rebels. I was in Afghanistan and the rest. And throughout my career, I've had a fundamental, I've fundamentally believed in what the UN represents and the Charter. You know, and so I haven't given up on the UN. I really want to help the UN to realize the dramatic point at which it finds itself, and to help it reform internally. There's still some good people in the UN. I mean, there's still a lot of good.
I believe so.
But they are in there, and they believe that the system should operate differently. And I want to use the experience I've gained through my years working in the UN and in conflict settings. You know, I want to work with them to help the UN change. So as far as Myanmar is concerned, the UN can become a player, but it has to change its approach and it has to find courage. But there is a crying need for the UN to assume its responsibilities in Myanmar. And as long as the structure exists, I and others will try to push it to do the right thing.
Listening to what you just said, I have a thought came to my mind that maybe Myanmar people need to intervene in the UN. Because Myanmar people have given up on UN, I think, right?
Yeah, I agree. They need to insist. Yeah. The Myanmar people should say, why aren't you
I think
here?
They have lost faith in the UN
as
an institutions.
Which is dramatic. Huh? When you think of an institution that was
born,
2 world wars to help create a better world, and that the people, I mean, I think the saddest picture I saw after the coup were those placards of R2P.
Right.
That I think was profoundly sad. And then to listen to politicians in Europe and in Australia, government officials say yes, R2P, when they knew there would be no R2P intervention. No, I agree. It's a very, very sad situation where the people of this country have lost faith in the UN.
In your earlier remark, you talk about revolution. And now we also discuss about aid. And I'm sure that the local actors, they don't want to be divided by humanitarian aid and assistance, because aid is also very political. And it has its own regulations and its own categories and its own mandate. Yeah. But in the past, when aid delivered to the local communities, it rather is more like creating a division among the local communities. So how do we change it? Because we now have a new generation of leadership leading the revolution. Yeah. And also the other group is arguing that the aid that humanitarian assistance must come now. But also the political groups and Myanmar people wanted to be free from the SAC, wanted to be free from this regime. And they want revolution to, I think, to win. Or how do we reconcile it? These two issues.
One, I think it would be, well, of course, difficult, but I think one needs to start from the bottom and go up. I think the first thing is there needs to be acknowledgement of of these local governance structures and how they're operating, and to not fall into the trap of saying this is the beginning of a fragmenting of Myanmar, to see it as the beginning of a bottom-up form of federalism, which is very important.
Very positive thinking.
Yeah,
and the positive approach to see that because there are fear-monger that Myanmar is going to be split up and divided, even a balkanization. But this is not going to happen.
But it won't happen unless, I think it can be prevented from happening if there's acknowledgement of what's happening on the ground. So I think there needs to be acknowledgement of that. There needs to be, on the part of donors, there needs to be a genuine commitment to not taking the ownership of the process away from these local structures.
Very important.
Yeah, so I think there needs to be some sort of partnership with these groups. The one concern I have for Karenni is that they become the donor darlings, and that as a result they get flooded. So when I was talking to, for example, people from the Interim Executive Committee and the KSCC, I was telling them, because it was really interesting. I met somebody who was telling me, we are trying to work according to international standards. And I told them, there are no international standards for what you are doing. You are setting the international standards for what you are doing. And then I told them, what you need to do, you'll have all of these people who are going to come and they'll offer assistance. And I said, what you need to do is you need to invite them, tell them to spend a month in Karenni, and after a month, they tell you what they're going to offer, what they're proposing to offer. So they need to keep that ownership. And then I think the international community has to acknowledge that humanitarian aid in a revolutionary setting has limits in terms of what it can provide. And as a result, you need to come up with a parallel form of intervention.
What you just said is brilliant. It's really brilliant because you talk about ownership, and you talk about donors to have ability to listen and learn, not to come to impose or work in the old traditional way, right? Am I right?
Yeah. And I think also it'll be a lot cheaper. I think when you look at I saw a number of projects, or I mentioned a number of projects. When you look at the envelopes, rebuilding a hospital for $100,000, when you look at the amounts that are actually needed, they're nothing compared to these appeals. So if donors were willing to go down that track, it would be much, much cheaper than these classic humanitarian appeals.
So Charles, tell me about what you just saw over there, the local initiative, for instance, like livelihoods and economic activities, vocational trainings, and how the local people are helping each other. Can you share some examples?
Yeah, I mean, I think what makes Karenni sort of exceptional, well, two things that make Karenni exceptional. The first is the fact that unlike the ethnic armed areas where you have a well-established administration, in Karenni State, it's an administration that's coming into form. So there's a lot more space for local initiatives. So that's the first. The second is that so many of the young from Yangon and the urban centers, Mandalay, actually moved to Karenni with with a new form of dynamism. But what one sees, of course, IDPs, I estimate of up to 80% of the population has been forced to flee because of the bombings and the rest. But what you see very quickly are the emergence of microeconomies. You see, cafes, tattoo parlors, hairdressers, A lot of people from Loiko or Demoso who had industries like flour mills who wanted to cash in. Well, a number of these young people young activists coming from Yangon or Mandalay actually buy the industry. And they have this system where 40% of their revenue goes for the functioning of the entity, 60% goes to the revolution and supporting the revolution. And supporting the revolution is either support to IDPs or support to frontline troops. You've got a dynamic, it's incredibly dynamic, incredibly committed, and as one would expect in a revolution, it's everybody is behind it.
But Karenni is the exception. What about other ethnic states?
Well, that's where I was coming to what I said before. I think what's interesting is a number of other ethnic groups are actually looking at, for example, the interim executive committee of Karenni and attempting to replicate it. So it is it's an exception, but I think it's slowly turning into an example of governance. And it's a governance model that, I mean, a lot of the other ethnic groups are principally armed groups who've been resisting for decades, to which have been attached administrations that function. I mean, some of the administrations more than others. And I think what Karenni is providing is the model of governance that
right.
goes and so that I think is starting to influence. My understanding is that's starting to influence some of the other groups.
You were former head of the UN, and now you were seeing a revolution taking place in Burma or in Myanmar, and you're critic on the UN, and we see that, So, past and the present, what is your sharing? What do you want to share with us? Your old days working in Yangon, and
I mean, in terms of the UN, what I want to do is to get the UN to understand that a lot of the constraints that they feel they operate under are self-imposed. I think if that it is possible to do a lot more, and it's possible to navigate the risks involved, and that's what I want to tell my UN colleagues. But and the reason I want to say it is because the UN has a critical role to play, and I think what you were saying before, which was very strong, is it's a tragedy that the people of a country would have lost confidence in the UN. It's not, and for me it's a tragedy that the UN needs to understand, it needs to confront. It's not the fact that the people have lost confidence. It's not the people who've lost confidence who are at fault. It's the UN who's at fault for allowing the people to lose confidence in it.
I want to hear your comparison between the previous regime and the current regime.
Oh, you mean the military regime?
The military regime.
That's an interesting question. Well, I mean, the previous regime, as we discussed, was, and my period, was very much defined by Khin Yount. The period when Khin Yount, head of military intelligence, was around, and then after. I think, after the purge in October 2004 and early 2005, I think the regime we saw is a softer version of what we see today, in terms. Although, during the Khin Yount period, I think there was an opportunity to work in Myanmar, principally because military intelligence, they follow individuals and had a very good sense of how poor the people were. So there was space. Khin Yount was purged, and then you ended up with sort of a classic junta, and they were very difficult to deal with. They weren't as bloody, although the four-cut strategy in certain areas were ruthless.
It's keyword, I found it, space.
Yeah.
We had the argument, a debate, last
good question.
10 years, 20 years about the space.
Yeah.
Political space or humanitarian
Yeah.
space. You remember?
Yeah.
So that's, I
want
want you to explore more on the current regime and who may try to argue that the space they may have a space inside the country.
Yeah.
Or either it's delusional or it's a reality.
Well, I think, from the period I was in Myanmar, 2003 to 2007, from 2003 until the end of 2004, when Kim Yunt was still the head of military intelligence, there was space. And it's because there was an understanding of how vulnerable the population was. From 2005 to 2007, the space started shrinking.
Because after Kim was removed.
After Kim Yunt was removed, because they got rid of the whole of military intelligence, and it took them a few years to reassert full control of the country. Not that they lost much. Now with the coup, I would argue that the UN actually has a lot more space. Because
how?
Because they need to find a way to operate outside SAC-controlled areas. They have the mandate to do it. They have the humanitarian mandate.
But they don't.
They do. They're just not using it.
No, I'm saying that they don't
operate.
They don't operate.
Yeah, that's the problem. And I don't think. Yeah, exactly. That's the problem. They need to find a way to operate. They can find a way to operate. They just need courage.
What is your advice? So what is your thought or on the ASEAN 5-point consensus? One of them is to deliver the aid assistance, and also UN agencies working inside the country, as well as international donors on this, issue of revolution and aid. So what is your, sweet advice to them?
Well, the 5-point consensus, I think, has been around for a while without necessarily big results. I think my key recommendation would be to embrace the Thai initiative. Embrace or see the Thai initiative as the beginning of an opportunity to really start addressing the humanitarian problems. It may not result in the corridor. We don't know what the corridor is about. But the fact that Thailand is engaging in that sort of reflection, I think we should embrace that and help in the thinking.
But there's a fear that this humanitarian corridor may lend a legitimacy to the regime.
I don't think anything can. Definitely not with the people. Maybe outside, but the legitimacy question I think is sort of a nice intellectual question. I think on the ground, legitimacy, non-legitimacy, it's very clear. You get bombed, you listen to you see the jets fly over you, or you get the mortars. It's not going to make you like them.
We keep hearing the horrendous stories every day. The regimes in the form of committing war crimes.
Yeah, big time.
At the degree of war crimes. Hopefully next time, I hope that we can have more time to talk about transitional justice.
Yeah.
So my last question is, what do you want to give a hopeful message to people in Myanmar, and including those revolutionaries and those local governance actors?
My message would be total admiration for what you're doing. I think the fact that you're no longer depending on outside help to deal with your situation is more than correct. It shows your strength. My message is more the admiration, the hope that they've given me in terms of people resisting and building. I think the only message I can give them is sincere congratulations for resisting the way you're resisting.
Thank you very much, Charles. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.